Etzel to the stage, who is the Vice President of U.S. Sales at S&C Electric. And Gary is going to give a presentation on grid reliability and the role of renewables and distributed energy integration as the grid evolves. And then we're going to take a few questions. So as Gary gives the presentation, please send them into the app. It's gtm.cnf.io, and I will be here logging some of those questions. So when you're done, we'll have a few questions from the crowd.
Perfect. Looking forward to it. Thanks, Stephen. Appreciate the introduction. Distributed energy resources have been coming about for a number of years. Solar, wind, now energy storage. But even before that, the electric power grid was providing energy to consumers and to industrials for a number of years to a very satisfied consumer group. So something has changed. And part of what has changed is the expectations of the grid. The use of the grid is changing dramatically. The grid itself is starting to change, but it's a little bit slow to catch up with where the users want it to be. Now, there are some myths out there, and there's some questions that I think we ought to explore today. One of them is, how do we measure reliability in the electric grid? Is that keeping up with what we require as reliability in the electric grid today? And I'd like to start by exploring one myth that is out there that says distributed energy resources, solar, wind, storage, different versions, are damaging the reliability of the electrical grid. That's out there. Stephen alluded to a report that we're looking forward to coming from the DOE on electric reliability. And point of fact, the analysis group did send that report out, I think it was yesterday. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But for now, what we did is we decided we'd take a look at the reliability indices and look at them from different points of view. In the United Kingdom, their percentage of distributed energy resources is much larger than in the United States. Granted, they're different sizes. Granted, in the United Kingdom, their regulatory body is Ofgem, Office of Gas and Electric Management, and they manage the whole country. And in years past, they sent out regulations to the entire country that offered incentives and disincentives for reliability improvement or none. So what we did is we said, well, we also developed standard, IEEE standard 1366, was developed in the 80s and 90s. It takes a while to get through these, but it was issued in the late 90s. And that defined two measurements, SAIDI and SAIFI. And I talked to a few people last night and said, do you know what SAIDI is? And one side guy said, yes, I think I met SAIDI last night at the bar in the Hilton. I said, well, it's not the same thing. SAIDI, system average, interruption, duration index. Safety is the system average, frequency index. Basically, we're trying to measure how often and how long there are interruptions for consumers in the United States. So let's take a look at what's happened over the last 16 years since we developed these indices. This is the United States. And we like to think we're very progressive and the leader in the world, and we have gone flat in the last 16 years on SAIDI and SAIFI. The United Kingdom, on the other hand, has, driven by the regulatory body of Ofgem, managed to drop their SAIDI and SAIFI indices by 50 to 60%. Dramatic change in countries that are using more distributed energy resources than we're using in the United States. So it's driven by regulation, so I don't get it. What's changed? Well, let's talk about what's changed. The expectation has changed. We've changed. What are the expectations of today versus the 1970s? We're in a different world today than we were in the 1970s. It was often said in the 1970s that 70s, 80s, and 90s, that if Alexander Graham Bell came back and saw us all wandering around with phones in our pockets and earphones talking to whoever on a phone, he would run for the hills because he wouldn't understand what we were doing. On the other hand, if Thomas Edison came back and looked at the electrical grid, even as late as the 90s, he'd look around and say, yeah, I got this. Kind of looks like it did when I started this thing in the early 1900s. So, what's changed? Well, our expectations have changed. We've changed. Now, we're going to check the age of the audience. How many of you recognize this digital clock radio? Oh, thank God I'm not the only one. Unfortunately, I am old enough that when my parents sent me off to college, they wanted to outfit me with the latest and greatest tools, and so this was my digital clock radio. It was okay back then. Didn't worry about momentary outages or blinks. I was in college, so I probably didn't worry a lot about sustained outages and blinks, but that's a story for a different day. So, our expectations have changed. We no longer live in the analog world. My digital clock, for those of you that remember it, had a little motor inside that had this really annoying whir sound. So it was nice that it flipped digital numbers, but it really wasn't a digital clock. We live in the digital age. We live in the computer age. We live in the age where blinks cause a problem. And our expectations now are different. I have 4 sons, and I can guarantee you what you're going to see next is minor compared to what would happen at my house.
Okay, I think the internet just went down.
Huh. I'll just give it a sec. We'll come back.
Something just happened in the world, and we have no idea what it was.
Well, I hear a lot of chuckles out there. None of my sons were musically inclined, so we didn't even get the piano. But one thing that we have to look at is the SAIDI and SAIFI numbers, the reliability that we talked about. Those reliability numbers were targeted at in the 70s and 80s when they were figuring this out is what would be really fast to get power back. I thought, well, gee, if you can get power back in 5 minutes, nobody's going to care. Everything's going to work, and the lights will continue to stay on. So we set SAIDI and SAIFI up for 5-minute intervals. So that's what we're measuring reliability on, 5 minutes. Our daughter in the video, the internet was out for 4 minutes, and believe it or not, one of my sons did say this, I have no contact with the outside world. At 4 minutes, she had no contact with the outside world, and according to the way we measure reliability, we wouldn't notice. Wouldn't move the needle. It's not something we worry about for reliability. So let's unpack that a little bit. In the United States, the utilities are required, and all of them do report SAIDI and SAIFI numbers on an annual basis. It's a measurement by the state public utility commissions. How do things work? How are we improving reliability? Basically, similar questions to what they were asking in the UK, but let me draw your attention to that middle section. Only 20% of the investor-owned utilities in the United States report momentary outages. Momentary being defined as less than 5 minutes. There are some that measure at 3 minutes, but less than 5 minutes is recorded as a momentary outage, and we only report that 20% of the time. That means 100 million customers and their outages are not subject to that report. It's like, wow. That makes me wonder, are we actually going after the right things in this digital age? Because we know outages cost money, right? We saw Dad in there close his laptop. I think that was after only a minute. Let's presume Dad was working on something. How many of you have had your blink when you've been diligently working on something on your computer, you didn't have it on automatic save, and the blink, and it said unrecoverable, and that report or spreadsheet you were working on is gone, and you start over? Nobody? Probably a lot. If you're actually honest, I would suspect that it's almost all of you. So we know that that costs money. We know that it costs money for consumers, maybe not as much as businesses, data centers, all of those folks, it costs money. How much? Well, our friends at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs were kind enough to calculate that. Sustained outages, which is what we use for SAIDI and SAIFI, are $26 billion a year. That's with a B. $26 billion a year, not in utility cost. That's the consumer cost. That's our cost that we're probably not getting back. $26 billion a year. Big number. And the utilities are definitely working hard to go after that number. But as I would imagine, most of you have seen pictures of icebergs before. And you're waiting for what comes next. Momentary outages, the less than 5 minute version, cost twice that. $52 billion a year are the cost of momentary outages to society in general. Twice that of sustained outages. Big number. Excuse me. Let me do my Marco Rubio imitation. So we know that reliability or poor reliability costs us money. So we've got to do something to go after that. Well, the tools that the utilities have and the things that are identified are SAIDI and SAIFI. So they are working very hard to go after those sustained outages. I can tell you that they are not always supported by the legislature. Personal note, ComEd in Chicago years ago was going after smart grid funding. Going after it very hard, and it had to go through the state legislature. Unfortunately, our governor at the time, not the governor that's in jail, the one before him, our governor at the time believed that roads and railroads needed to be modernized. The grid was just fine. Took almost 2 years of educating state legislators and all of their PUC commissioners, and finally ComEd got the smart grid resolution through. And they have been going after sustained outages and doing a marvelous job and being able to dramatically improve those sustained outages and reduce the SAIDI and SAIFI numbers for their customers. So that works really well. On the other hand, there are times when we reduce a sustained outage, and the techniques that we use to reduce sustained outages cause momentary outages. Like, well, that's kind of a problem. And let me give you one example. Hospitals. I'm sure you realize that there is an accreditation group for hospitals. It's called the Joint Commission, or JCO. The Joint Commission goes around to hospitals on a periodic basis every couple of years, and you have to be ready for the accreditation for a hospital. Did you know that in a hospital, they're all required to have generators as backup? In a hospital, a momentary outage means the generator kicks on. There are UPS in uninterruptible power supplies in certain areas of the hospital for individual machines, certainly data centers. I have no doubt the billing system has got a large UPS. But in general, the lights in the hospital can go out for 10 seconds before the generator is ready to pick up load. And that means the hospital is in good shape and it's accredited. So think about that. Hold your breath, close your eyes, whatever. Just think about it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, the lights are back on. I'm not sure I want to be the guy with my chest cracked open with the surgeon standing there frozen, waiting for the lights to come back on. We need to measure and acknowledge reliability a different way. One of the challenges is hospitals count those 10-second interruptions as disturbances. Looking from the utility side, if we're looking for reliability improvement, they don't necessarily count. Excuse me. So, system power outages from the hospital venue might look quite different from what the utility believes is happening. For instance, in a recent hospital conference I was at, we had the local utility stand up and give a presentation on what they're doing about reliability and how they're improving the SAIDI and safety numbers, and showed dramatic improvement over 3 years, only to be followed by the hospital facility engineer who said, I've got the proof that I've had more disturbances this year than the last 3 years combined. So we are looking at the same problem, 2 different directions with 2 different sets of glasses. We need to change that. We need to measure momentaries and system sustained outages so that, to paraphrase a different group, there's no outage left behind. To be fair, ComEd is also going after momentary outages now. There are pockets in the country where they're going after momentary outages. Florida Power and Light being one of them. In Florida, as you might imagine, they have a lot of, as we call them, snowbirds. And they're coming from New York to Florida with their DirecTV. And if there's a blink in the system for a few seconds, the DirecTV blinks out and takes 10 minutes to reset, which does not sit well with the folks that are snowbirds. So what did Florida Power and Light do? Rather than say that doesn't count, which also, to be fair, in the UK, we did have a conference there, and we did have a utility stand up and say, yeah, we measure 3 minutes. We think that's close enough. If it's less than that, it doesn't count, doesn't affect us, we're not going after it. Interesting position. That's not the position Florida Power and Light took. They said, no, we're going to set up our own measurement. They call it CME, Customer Momentary Experience. They look at the customer momentary experience and they say, nope, in this area, the momentary experience is worse. We're going to go after momentaries in that area. and they do that. There are other utilities that do that, some a bit smaller. The Electric Power Board in Chattanooga installed 1,200 smart switches across their system. And their 1,200 smart switches are giving them a bunch of benefits, not the least of which is reconfiguring the grid, but also gathering data. So, in January of 2013, a tree fell across from a storm. A tree fell across a large feeder, took out 11,000 homes and businesses. Each red dot on the screen represents a home or business without power. But they installed the smart switches and they installed the smart system, so the grid itself looked at that and said, wow, there's a power outage from this feeder. What do I do about it? 28 seconds later, the grid had reconfigured. The grid had reconfigured so that 10,000 of those 11,000 were back in power. The system looked again. 15 seconds later, reconfigured, more were back in power. Then we brought in the dispatchers and central dispatch. And they looked and made some other decisions and brought a few more people back. And then lastly, the last group, 2 minutes and 43 seconds after that, they flipped the switches and brought everybody back. And now they still have to go out and fix that one feeder. But they've restored power to 11,000 customers from an outage in less than 7 minutes. Normally, that would take half a day to a day just to dispatch trucks. And it would cost them a lot of money because it's not cheap to roll all the trucks, to run around all those switches and decide which ones I open, which ones I close. How do I get these people back in power? Do I make a mistake because you've got humans doing all these things? Do I open the wrong switch, close the wrong switch? Do I send trucks to the wrong place? Now they've got the grid doing almost all the work, and you can target the truck and say, send it there, that'll fix it. So the utility saves money. Customers are restored. Everybody is pretty happy, and they're getting some side benefits. Customers are saving money because in a lot of areas they say, well, I need critical power, so they'll bring 2 and 3 extra sources in. They don't have to do that in Chattanooga. And the switches are storing data. So the switches are storing data, which allows them to analyze different things. One point, one of the plants complained of nuisance trips. And Chattanooga was able to access the data in their switch. And after looking at the data, they went back to the plant and said, gee, we'd really like to take a look at some of the settings on your breakers in your facility. And when they did that, discovered one was incorrectly set, fixed it. Happy utility, happy customer. So, in order to get to where we need to go, we need to change the reliability measurements. We need to go after not just the sustained outages, but we need to go after the momentary outages as well. About 70% of outages for systems where the lines are overhead are, 70% of them are temporary. Branch falls over, a squirrel jumps across the phases, and it goes away quickly. But there are hundreds of thousands of devices out there, fuses. We know because we're one of the large manufacturers of fuses, so we're grateful, but that turns that temporary outage into a permanent outage until the utility rolls a truck out to fix it. There are devices, we manufacture those also, that can mitigate that and open, close without rolling a truck, wait for the branch to fall away, close back in, customers back in power, utility save money, customers back, everybody's happy. So there are ways to do that. We've been involved in business cases that analyze that. It's a 2 to 3 year payback on certain situations. And after that, The savings to the utility and the reliability improvement are free. So it is doable, it is economic. So we are at an interesting apex in our industry. We have an obligation to keep the lights on. Keeping the lights on in the 70s, or keeping my digital clock in my college dorm room in the 70s, wasn't that tough. Second, 2 second, little bit of an outage, really weren't going to be noticed. Today, a 3 second blink, 1, 2, 3, the router in your house going to connect you to the internet is out. How do you get it restarted? Sometimes it goes by itself. Sometimes you unplug it, wait 30 seconds, plug it back in. I've been to all those routines. So we have an obligation to keep the lights on. The world is different. The grid is different. Measurements have to be different. Our definition of reliability has to change, because the grid we need today or tomorrow is not the old grid that we have. The old grid that Thomas Edison knew about, power was generated in one area, flowed in one direction on a transmission line down to the distribution system. And that all worked. That's how it was built. Basically, it's how it still is. Where are we going? Power is flowing in all different directions. Some from the central generation, some from the solar plant, some from the wind plant, some from energy storage, some from all kinds of different areas, and it's flowing in all different directions. Down the grid, up the grid, sideways in the grid. So we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to the industry to recognize that the old grid's not the grid that we need tomorrow. Distributed energy resources are not causing grid reliability problems. They are highlighting grid reliability problems, but they're not the cause of it, as we can see from the UK examples, and of course our own recent DOE report. So they're not causing it, but they are highlighting it. We need to change how we manage the grid. We need to change how we measure outages so there's no outage left behind. It's an old adage, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. If you can't manage it, you can't improve it. We have to improve it. We have to bring the old grid into the 21st century and make Thomas Edison shake his head and go, I don't get it, I don't understand. We can get there. Utilities have proven it. Now we have to do it system-wide. Thanks.
So we just have a minute left here, and I guess I'm going to synthesize some of these questions that came in and really try to encapsulate what you described in that last slide. And that is, how does the industry talk about this? And what's the role of distributed resources and renewables in improving grid reliability? And if there is this broader political discussion about their role in, the perceived role of decreasing reliability, how should the folks in this room, how does S&C Electric talk about those resources as a way to improve reliability on the grid?
Sure. We are doing work with a number of utilities in the country, defining the possibilities in the grid. And you can do it feeder by feeder, utility by utility, analyze, and the best way to get started is if you walk into any utility in the country, and you walk into the distribution folks and say, what are your 3 worst performing feeders? They instantly know. Everybody knows who the worst ones are. Great. So you look at those and you say, well, what are the methods that we can use to improve reliability on that? And there are a variety of different methods. One might be implementation of renewables, depending on your goals. If you implement renewables, obviously sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, so energy storage is another way to use those two together to support the grid and support the idea that things can be better but different, and how do we do it reliably. So in these days, you really have got to analyze a couple of things. For your investor-owned utilities, you have to analyze capital expense versus O&M or operational expense. Capital expense, we invest and there's a return on that. Operational expense is just money out of your pocket. We do analysis of those in business cases all the time.
So it sounds like what you're saying is the technologies are ready. We just need to figure out the best ways to pay for them and integrate different sets of technologies for utilities.
Sure. Most of the technologies are ready. Energy storage is ready as a technology. Energy storage for batteries, it has been made great leaps. There are a bunch of different battery chemistry folks out there working on the new chemistries. It is not yet completely economically viable for battery storage if it only does one job. If you can get it to do 2 or 3, the IEEE is defined somewhere between 16 and 24 different functions of storage. So if you can get it to do 2 or 3 jobs, then it's economically viable. If not, then it's a challenge. But battery companies are working hard, taking big risks. Unfortunately, a lot of them take big risks, lose, and gone. But there are continuing folks. Obviously, we know our friend Mr. Musk at Tesla, making big risks, trying new things. So the technology's there. Microgrids are another opportunity to look at a small section of the grid and identify distributed resources that in certain periods of time for reliability, you might island that away from the main grid. Microgrids are generally always connected to the main grid. So the utility owning the microgrid makes perfect sense, and might use them for peak loads in various seasons and say, well, you're on a microgrid now, so that we can cover the rest of it. Utilities have a big challenge. Utilities have a big challenge because the connections are going up, and we've been in a country very good at conserving energy. So connections are going up, loads are static or going down, means revenue is static or going down. So how do you manage that? So they have a challenge.
Gary Wetzel is the Vice President of U.S. Sales at S&C Electric. Thank you, Gary. We appreciate it.
Thanks,
and I hope that this will be a topic that everyone is talking about in the conference. I think it's a super important one.
That'd be great.
And so now we're going to go on to our final panel of the morning before our break. This is going to be our Megatrends panel, Megatrends at the Grid Edge. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be a great conversation. And then afterward, we'll have a coffee break, so stick around.